David here. Welcome to the channel. Today's all about systems in order. When can systems become more ordered over time? And this plays a critical role in life. This is chapter 9 of the book, The Science of Systems. If you want to learn more about the book, you can go to davidsugar.com/book. There you can download a free PDF of the book. Additionally, if you want to buy the paperback, you can go to amazon.com. There you can see all the images in person. So wanted to go over what does ordering mean for a system. Here a system is denoted S, and a system under order, at least defined in this book, is when the change of the entropy is less than 0. So what is entropy? Entropy is often a measure of disorder. So when the entropy is less than 0, this means that it's becoming more ordered. Entropy is often associated with dispersal of thermodynamic energy, that things over time tend to become more dispersed. Energy tends to disperse, not coalesce. But ordering is also about coalescing energy, using energy in controlled ways. Now, one example can be seen in the graph here. This shows different microstates with little light gray and dark gray boxes and the average macro state. Now, the average macro state is taking a coarse grain average. Now, high entropy, which also means low order, is when many different microstates can lead to the same macro state. We see in this box, there's many different mixed microstates that lead to the macro state of about an average mixture, about half light gray and about half dark gray. However, in the graph below, it shows a low entropy or high ordered state. And this just means that one or just a few of the microstates can lead to a given macro state. So the given macro state is that all the light gray are on one side, all the dark gray are on one side. There's just one internal combination that allows this. There's lots of internal combinations that allow them to be mixed. So ordering occurs when a system goes from high entropy to low entropy. So in this case, that would literally mean ordering the little micro boxes so that the macro state is a more rare occurrence, that there's less microstates that lead to a given macro state. There's different definitions of entropy. This is taking a thermodynamic approach. One is that the change of entropy equals the change of heat divided by temperature. So this is an interesting definition because you see here that entropy has the units of energy divided by temperature. So entropy you could think about as a way to connect energy to a given temperature. So it's deeply related to the notion of temperature in connection with energy. Now, you could take a statistical approach for entropy, and this uses the Boltzmann constant KB, and then you sum up the probability of a given microstate Px and the log of the inverse of that probability. So something with high entropy, high disordered, means the probability is less. You know lower about the microstate. In a highly ordered state, the macrostate would tell you a lot about what configurations the microstate is. In high disorder, you don't know. There's many microstates that can potentially lead to a given macrostate. Now, when each state is equally likely, you don't need to do this basically weighted average approach where you sum up the probabilities in the log of the inverse probability. When each is equally likely, this formula simplifies into that the entropy is the Boltzmann constant times the log of the number of states. So this would mean that a system with more microstates for a given macrostate has higher entropy. So ordering in this case with each state being equally likely means that the system is configured where there's less microstates for a given macrostate. Now, I'll just make a quick little note here that this is taking a thermodynamic approach to entropy. If one takes the information approach to entropy, also called Shannon entropy, the formulas are really the same, except that Boltzmann constant is removed. So it basically is the sum of the probability of the microstate X and the log divided by the probability, or entropy just equals the log of the number of states. Now, I'll just state that The informational entropy, it's not only considering the energetic microstates, it can consider any kind of state. So maybe that a transistor is on or off or something like that. But the thermodynamic entropy, in a way, sets the limit. A system can never have more information than all the energetic degrees of freedom. So the energetic degrees of freedom, in a way, set the maximum amount of entropy. Basically, a system can't contain more information than all the information missing about its microstates, which is the thermodynamic entropy. And we'll talk a little bit more about information entropy and thermodynamic entropy. They're not equal. They're related. Sometimes they even seem a little opposite, but we'll get into that more in the next chapter. So, following the second law of thermodynamics, the entropy of a closed system, or isolated system more specifically, tends to increase over time. This means that there tends to be more disorder in an isolated system. So this leads to kind of an interesting question. How is it possible that some systems seem to become more ordered over time? And one of the most, vivid examples is life. Life seems to create order all the time. Created ordered biological structures, created ordered engineering systems. We create ordered structures in our world. But how is that possible if entropy is supposed to increase over time? Well, entropy is supposed to increase only for isolated systems. So for open systems, it's possible for entropy to decrease in open systems through the exchange of energy. Now, entropy can decrease in an open system, creating order, but this has the knock-on effect that it creates more entropy or the same amount of entropy in the environment. So if entropy is decreasing for a given subsystem X, it means that everything in the environment outside of X, the universe minus X, U minus X here, it must increase. Now, it must increase the same or more if it's an isolated system. If it's perfectly efficient, all the negative entropy in a given subsystem, the order can be perfectly offset by the environment, but typically with inefficient processes, there'll be more entropy created in the environment. So in order to create order in an open system, this also creates more disorder in the environment. Now, a really good example to understand entropy and its connection to heat is the Carnot engine. And this is an idealized heat cycle of an idealized gas. And this is a perfectly efficient engine. And it describes how work can be extracted as heat flows from a hot reserve to a cold reserve. So this is a hot reserve with temperature TH and a cold reserve with temperature TC. Now, a really good example of this is like a steam engine. So there's hot steam created by the coal burning in the steam engine, and the environment is the cold outside. And as the heat flows from hot to cold, these pistons are extracting work, and that's powering the steam engine. So the Carnot idealized heat engine is the maximum possible work, assuming there's no extra entropy created. All that heat energy is transmitted directly into work. How much possible work could you get as heat flows? Now, you can think about this as also a piston with some gas inside of it. So imagine the gas, is at a cool temperature, and so it's not expanded. Now, if it's put into that hot reserve, gas inside the piston will want to expand because the temperature is heating up, the molecules are bouncing, so you can extract work from there. If you place it in the cold reserve, the extra heat will flow out and the particles will reset back. It can go back to the hot reserve, expand again, and you can extract work in this way. But this can also be done in reverse. If you put work in, you can increase the heat differences between a hot and cold reserve. So this is seen in refrigerators. Refrigerators basically input work and increase the heat differences. So it makes a cold reserve more cold compared to the outside. Now, another way that entropy can be thought about is in terms of these microstates. And this is a really common example to explain entropy. Here, there's two different sides of a box, and this represents the different states that these particles can be in. There's light gray and dark gray particles. And the left side of the image shows a low entropy state, where there's just one microstate, just one combination that allows all the light gray particles to be on one side and all the dark gray particles to be on the other side. Now there's a little door in between these chambers so the particles can mix. Now the right side shows an example when entropy is increasing. There's a lot of different microstates that can add up to that given average macrostate, which has 2 or 3 light gray particles on a given side. So here there's 10 microstates, so basically 10 combinations of these particles that can add up to this average macrostate. And so if the gases were initially separated, like the left side, and this door was open, it is statistically likely that the system evolves into a high entropy state. There's just a lot more configurations. Even though each state is equally probable, there's only one state where they're all separate, and there's 10 states where they're mixed. So we would tend to see that the gas would mix over time. And so the entropy is increasing, and this is also often connected with the arrow of time, right? If you have two particles separated, two groups of particles, and in two chambers, and now a door opens, you would, over time, you would statistically expect them to mix. You wouldn't expect a mixed gas, for example, to become ordered over time to have less entropy. However, I'll just state that, using energy and, identifying which particles which and pushing them on each side, opening and closing the door at the right time or something like that, it is possible to separate the particles like that, but that requires energy. So entropy decreasing or ordering the system would be separating them into where there's just one microstate, just a few microstates that add up to a given macrostate. Now, I'll just state that this other example of separated particles and mixed particles, that's often given with entropy, but sometimes this can be a little confusing because some systems have a low entropy state when they're mixed or they appear mixed, and a high entropy state when they appear coalesced. But this is because entropy often relates to what we said before, dispersal of energy. So it's not only just about what appears mixed or not, that can often lead to confusion. It's often about the energy involved in all the energetic microstates. So with attracting gravitational bodies, a low entropy state would be that these gravitational bodies are all separated from each other. Now, over time, you would expect them to coalesce in the middle to come together through the force of gravity. But that's actually a high entropy state. There's like heat and other things when they come together. There's a lot more energetic microstates available, actually. So a low entropy state with gravitational bodies would actually be separated. And in oil and water, a low entropy state is when the oil and water is separated into these different regions. Over time, you would expect to see that the oil would be on top, the water would be on bottom, they would separate. There's the potential energy is a lot less, when they're in that separate state. Similarly, the gravitational bodies is a lot less. So basically, the energy is dispersing. Now, it's possible through adding entropy to go to a low entropy state. So with gravitational bodies, you can add entropy and move the bodies away from each other, move to a low entropy state. With oil and water, you can shake it up and then mix the oil and water. But over time, this is also connected with the arrow of time. You would expect to see systems go from low entropy to high entropy over time in an isolated system. However, in an open system, if you add energy, you could basically increase the potential energy, like coalesce energy in a way, add energy, and create a low entropy state, essentially ordering the system. So it's important to note that entropy isn't always about visual disorder, but it's about the energetic microstates, and that entropy is often connected with dispersion of energy. So coalescing energy, putting things in higher potential energy, for example, would be an example of a low entropy state of adding order to a system. So another type of way to think about entropy is through something called the Gibbs energy. This is symbolized with G, and this basically equals the negative entropy times the temperature plus the internal kinetic energy U plus the pressure and volume. Now this is at a stable pressure and volume. And what's really interesting about Gibbs energy is that it describes which reactions spontaneously occur and which ones require energy. They don't spontaneously occur, but if you add energy, they can occur. Now, exergonic reactions are these reactions where the change of free energy is negative. So we see here the reactants, it goes up, and then the Gibbs energy goes down. There's a little threshold, and then it goes down to the product. So this would spontaneously occur. It's lowering the Gibbs free energy. And at a given temperature and pressure and volume and the same kinetic energy, this would basically mean that the entropy increases because you see the entropy is inversely created with Gibbs energy. So the Gibbs energy goes down. And when the other variables are held static, the entropy increases. So basically, we tend to see, entropy increases in isolated systems, that systems tend to reduce the Gibbs free energy, increase entropy, and become less ordered. However, endergonic reactions are essentially the opposite when the change in free energy is positive. Now, these are not spontaneously, they don't just spontaneously occur, they require energy. But what we see is that this actually decreases entropy, that it would increase the order and decrease the entropy. So life uses, these kind of reactions in very controlled and precise ways to create ordered systems, to decrease the entropy, use energy from the environment in a controlled way, and do reactions that are not necessarily spontaneous. You wouldn't expect a leaf to just spontaneously form. It requires energy to create these structures because it's a very ordered pattern. It's not a disordered pattern. The energetic microstates are in a very highly ordered state. It's adding energy to the system to create these ordered patterns. So one of the key energy carriers in life is adenosine triphosphate, ATP. Now, when you add ATP with water, H2O, there's a chemical reaction where it goes to ADP, adenosine diphosphate. It releases the extra phosphate P, and it releases energy in the process. Now, additionally, this reaction can be done the other way. ADP plus phosphate plus energy can go back to ATP. So ATP is one of the key biological energy carriers in life. And for example, if there's an exergonic reaction, basically one that releases energy, like digesting sugar, energy is released in that process. And as energy is released, ADP plus phosphate can absorb that energy and turn into ATP. Now, ATP can be sent in other places in the organism, combine it with water, and now that can release energy. And now that can power endergonic reaction. All these reactions that require energy, that do not spontaneously occur. They decrease entropy, increase order at a given temperature and pressure and volume. So lots of biological processes like cell movement, building a lot of these more complex biomolecules, they require energy. It's creating order. It's something that won't spontaneously occur. But that can be occurred by using ATP, by using this energy that was captured elsewhere, releasing it at these given times. They can power these endergonic reactions and essentially create order. So life uses energy in highly controlled ways, absorbing energy, putting it into a carrier, ATP. There's other kinds of energy carriers. This is one of the most common ones. And then releasing it to power these critical order creating actions like cell movement and creating biological building blocks. Now, we talked a little bit about digesting sugar and want to go over some of these metabolic reactions. So these metabolic reactions are really key ways that energy is released in biological systems, and that can be captured, with ADP and phosphate and other mechanisms, so that energy can be captured and then used other places to create highly ordered structures. So one of the most common ones is glycolysis, and this is essentially the glucose C6H12O6 molecule. When that separates, it releases energy. So basically breaking down these sugars, and that releases 2-ADP. Now, a much more efficient way that biology has evolved to digest these sugars is through cellular respiration. And this is essentially adding oxygen. And when you add oxygen, that same sugar, when it's broken down, releases a lot more ADP, 36 to 38 ADPs. And the byproducts of this reaction are 6 carbon dioxide and 6 water. So this is really similar to, human respiration. We inhale oxygen, it combines with this sugar, cellular respiration, and then we exhale carbon dioxide. Now, plants have also evolved a really interesting way to capture energy through the sun, and this is through photosynthesis. And essentially, you see that this is the cellular respiration reaction, but in reverse. Essentially, when you put energy into this, this is an endergonic reaction. You have the carbon dioxide, you have the water, but you also add that sunlight energy in photosynthesis process. And then this now translates to glucose, the sugar, and oxygen byproduct. And then plants can then do cellular respiration, put the glucose, add oxygen, and then split it and get the energy in other places in the cell. Now, I'll just note that really interesting is that cellular respiration and photosynthesis, the reactions and the products of the chemical reactions are inverses of each other. So this creates a balancing effect on the atmospheric levels, where plants absorb a lot of this carbon dioxide, emit oxygen, but animals absorb a lot of this oxygen, emit carbon dioxide. And that's a way to balance the carbon and oxygen levels in the atmosphere. So these are really interesting metabolic reactions created by biology to, extract energy, capture it, and then use it to create order, creating processes and counter the effects of entropy, creating order in our world. So we talked about creating order, but it's helpful to distinguish how life creates order. And one theory around life that takes a systems perspective and was posed in 1972 by Maturana and Valera is essentially autopoiesis. And this is essentially saying life is created when the ordering system is self-making. So auto is self, poietic is making. Now, this contrasts allopoietic systems. Allopoietic is other making systems. So an example of an allopoietic system is a factory that creates a bicycle. So there's inputs. This would usually be low entropy, highly ordered inputs. They extract the energy. There's low energy, high entropy outputs. But that's used to create something other than the system producing the order. So for example, there's a factory, they use energetic inputs, and they might create something like a bicycle. Now, a bicycle is a highly ordered system. You wouldn't expect a bicycle just to form naturally, through entropy increasing in an isolated system, but through an open system, through using inputs in a specific way, you can create this highly ordered system. Now, this is an example of creating order for something that's not the system producing the order. Now, this contrasts the autopoietic system. Here, this diagram shows a hypothetical 3D printer, which has arms going all the ways and also a computer chip on the actual 3D printer. And this is a hypothetical, living 3D printer and computer that can make all the components of itself. I'll just say now that, right now, the only autopoietic systems that we know in science is life. Most of our 3D printers now and other things don't have all the aspects of life. So but this is a hypothetical one just to simplify it. And the notion is that through energetic inputs and the outputs that are released, the ordered thing that the system is making is not something else like, a bicycle on the factory, but it's creating the very system which is creating the order. So it's a meta process. So in this example, for example, this 3D printer, it would have simple inputs, but it would create everything it needed to run. So it would create its own motors. It would create its own computer chip. It would rebuild itself. It would self-heal. It would self-make its components. And so this is one attempt to understand what a living system is. It's not just any system creating order. It's creating order in a really specific way. It's creating order to self-make itself. Now, another attempt to understand what living systems are is through living systems theory by James Miller. And essentially, this understands living systems as open systems. So there can be inputs, low entropy, highly ordered, a lot of energy in these inputs. The output, high entropy, low energy typically. And so through these inputs, the living system can create order. Now, we saw before with autopoiesis is creating order in a highly specific way. It's making itself, it's not making something else. And there's also no external agent helping. So it's self-doing, this making. So it has the information required to self-make. And James Miller basically identified like different critical subsystems which would be required for, a cell or some type of living system to perform the actions of life. And he basically had 3 different categories. One of them is matter and information processes. So this would be like an ingester to ingest the energetic inputs, something to store, something to move, like a motor. There's also information processes, like input, memory, output. Basically, there needs to be like an instruction, right? Information to be able to run the system. So the information is a required aspect when it comes into life. That hypothetical 3D model, for example, it requires the information to self-make itself. Without that information, this object couldn't self-make. So it requires information of itself in order to make itself. Now, there's also some processes which are matter, energy, and information. So the boundary of the cell and replicating the cell, it basically involves both matter and energy processes and informational processes simultaneously. So this was an initial attempt to say, what are the critical subsystems of life? How can they be made in an idealized way to create this living system, this self-making system? So one example of life, one of the simplest units of life, or the smallest unit of life known is different cells. There's different types of cells, and this is shown in a eukaryote animal cell. So there's different organelles, different subcomponents of a cell, which enables the cell to live. And this accomplishes a lot of these subsystems that James Miller defined in the living systems theory. So this diagram shows various aspects of the cell. One critical part is the cell membrane, and that's the boundary. The nucleus contains the nucleolus, and there's the DNA inside of that, which is basically the information, the instruction set to make the cell in a way. And there's different other processes like the endoplasmic reticulum. Is basically kind of like this gateway, into the information in the DNA, and this helps send packages to help produce proteins, some of the building blocks of life. Vacuole is another place to store basically materials and waste. Microtubules are these other things that support the structure. And mitochondria are other key energy centers that produce energy. So all these critical substances are working together in a cell to create this living system. The cell is able to self-make, it's able to use energy from the environment in a specific way, create order, a low entropy, and self-make. So wanted to go over some key biological components seen in living systems. One is that we talked about earlier, the cell membrane. And this could be thought about as different lipids. And lipids are a kind of type of oil. And this basically separates, the internal region of the cell versus the environment. And this helps distinguish the boundary of the cell. There's also certain kind of like protein gates, which can help determine what enters and leaves the cell. Glucose, we saw earlier, was a key aspect of sugar, and this basically creates the biochemical category of carbohydrates. And this is used as energy. When it breaks down and releases energy, that can be absorbed by ADP and then turn into ATP and used in other places. Proteins are these amino acids and long chains of amino acids that fold into these different patterns. And the proteins are used as key construction elements in life and to help create a lot of the functions in living systems. DNA stores this information about the instructions of life. And the DNA encodes certain types of amino acids to allow proteins to be created. So basically, by reading off the DNA, the cells can basically create the various proteins in life and help create the whole structure of the cell. Now, what's really interesting is that these cells, they're in an aqueous environment. They're continuously surrounded by water. So it's really important to understand that water, protein, water membrane, water DNA, all that kind of interface. So one way is that when you think about the protein, one way is to consider the atomic bonds at a molecular level. This basically creates the molecular lattice. Now, zooming out a little bit, you can see there's various structures created by all these amino acids. When they put together all their chemical bonds, they would tend to be in a certain way. And this creates this folding structure. There could be different sheets, different spirals. Now, importantly, these are described by quantum mechanics. So there's quantum waves around, this whole thing is kind of a vibrating assortment of molecules. But this also creates the solvent surface, so the boundary that interacts with H2O water molecules. And so what's really important is that, this life can be thought about these miniature mosaic magnet pieces, in a water. So there's all these little biochemical components within water. They have their solvent surfaces. Some of them bond to others. Some of them don't bond to others. They can have locking key mechanisms. There's lots of different ways these different kind of mosaic pieces can fit together. And this creates all the functions and forms, seen in life. So when it comes to creating order on a more macro scale, there's different types of cells that organize in multicellular organisms. And one type of way this happens is through stem cells. So stem cells basically exist in this pre-differentiation. And then it separates into these different kind of categories. One is the ectoderm, kind of the outside. So this would be like skin and neural cells. Mesoderm, this kind of middle layer. So like red blood cells, the heart cells, and the endoderm, the internal organs like lungs, pancreas. So, the cells, they can exist in a pre-differentiation state like stem cells, and then they can differentiate into these different types of cells. And this often happens through epigenetics, where basically epigenetics is when something alters the DNA. So as the cell replicates, it produces the same change affects the new generations. So basically, once there's skin cells, it's differentiated to a skin cell through epigenetic factors. As it replicates, it will create more skin cells in that region. And these different cells can adhere to one another through something called cell adhesion. And this creates groups of different cells. So now there's groups of skin cells, there's groups of heart cells, groups of lung cells, and this creates different systems seen in the body. So it's a really interesting way that life not only organizes, in one cell, but also between multiple cells. And this creates a multicellular organization and a living system as a whole, which has new systems like, a heart, a lung, which can absorb oxygen for the multicellular organism at a holistic level. So we talked a little bit about nested order when we looked at fractal symmetries. But now talking about ordering and in the biological systems, it's helpful to bring this up again in terms of a morphological context. So morphology is the forms that are created. So we saw, there can be one cell organisms. Now this can have a multicellular organisms. Now, as these different cells come together, a common pattern that is seen is a nested morphology. So the form is nesting to smaller and smaller. So this is seen in muscles. So one is the skeletal muscle, which is a larger structure. Now, when you zoom into this skeletal muscle, there's different muscle fascicles. And these are kind of different like rope-like strands. Now, if you go look inside those strands, there's also muscle fibers. So it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And this is one way that living systems, multicellular living systems, are able to create order through creating nested morphology, so nested order systems. Now, zooming out even further, you can look at ecological patterns. So the patterns between different species of animals at a large macro level. Now, there's some key patterns in biological systems. Some of these include like dynamic balance. We're talking about the balance between carbon dioxide and oxygen in the atmosphere, that animals and plants have this reciprocal relation. This helps create a balance. Otherwise, if these balances wasn't met, the atmosphere would either be fully carbon dioxide, fully oxygen, and not support life. So having this balance is really important. Networks are really important. So there's often this, food chain with primary predators at the top, predators, herbivores, plants, and detrivores, which feed on the dead items. So it's not only helpful to think about this as a pyramid, but also in terms of a network, of a food web, because there's lots of interesting connections between all these different levels of organisms. And what's really important is, if you just take one like keystone species out, it can completely affect an ecosystem. Even, species that may not be expected that they would have a big effect, they have a huge effect. So these networks are really important when it comes to ecological patterns. We looked at nested systems in terms of fractals, morphology, and this even occurs, zooming out further where, different swarm intelligence, lots of fishes can organize into a group. There could be different groups. So this nested order is not only, at the cell, creating all the cells for one organism, but between organisms as well. Flows are really important. These energy flows, we saw life has to be open system to create order. Cycles of change is a common pattern. Evolution is another critical aspect, when it comes to ecology. And diversity is another aspect where you see there's a different image here of a lot of different animals in a coral reef, and they've kind of all evolved, to have some symbiotic relationships, some competitive relationships, but usually it's done in a balancing way to balance the ecosystem. A critical system used to create order and used in life a lot are control systems. Control systems essentially have a sensor which senses inputs from the environment, a controller which dictates what action should be taken from that sensor, and the action outputs results into the environment. One example seen in biology is the flagellum, which is a small hair protruding from some cells, and sensors in the cell sense, is the environment favorable or not favorable? If it's not favorable, the hair can move and push the cell along. And then if it senses that the cell is in a good environment, the hair will stop moving, so the cell will be in that environment. So control systems are used all the time in biology to help control action, to sense the environment, gain information, and then have specific actions. This helps enable creation of order through the use of energy. Now, control systems are really fundamental to cybernetics, which is the study of control and communication in the animal and machine. You see a control system. So, cybernetics is really related to control systems, also communication systems. And this image below is also showing a cybernetic loop. And this is essentially when the action can go back to the sensor. So an interesting feedback loop is, for example, with a microphone and then a speaker. The speaker is near the microphone. This can create a feedback loop. And a lot of the biological systems have this feedback loop where the cell, for example, it's moving into a more favorable environment. Well, now there's a feedback because by moving, it can now sense, is it in a different environment? Is it a more favorable or less favorable environment? And so there's a feedback loop between these sensors and actions. We'll talk more about information systems, which are deeply related to control and communication systems in the next chapter, but want to focus more on the biological aspect and how they're used to create order in this chapter. An interesting type of control systems application is to basically model different animals and for each of them to have a control. For example, like a school of fish, one rule may be that it wants to follow the other fish but not be too close, to leave a little distance. And through these models, you can basically model a whole bunch of fish with these different rules, different control system rules, and you can see how they evolve over time. Another application of this could be like a herd of large land mammals, modeling those different control factors. And often what's developed is the notion of a swarm intelligence. And this is when intelligent actions, intelligence here is defined as, specific controlled outputs regarding inputs. It doesn't necessarily mean a conscious, self-aware human mind. This just means, it could be artificial intelligence, computer intelligence, but it's basically sensing the environment and performing controlled actions, controlled intelligent actions for that sense. Swarm intelligence, you see that individual animals not only have their intelligence and control with the environment, but also together they can perform intelligent actions as a group. So group thinking, group problem solving. We often see these with like a whole flock of birds as they fly. There's actually aerodynamic efficiency by flying together. So by working together, they can often solve these problems. Ants are another great example. They often work together to complete, ant mounds or whole building different things together, solving problems, even forming little bridges so they can walk over gaps. So there's a lot of this swarm intelligence. And actually what we saw before, the control systems helps model these when it comes to the computer and understanding how different controlling actions can emerge a swarm intelligence effect. And now just wanted to end the chapter on some of the most interesting control systems and one of the most complex ones we see in the universe that we're aware of, and that is the human brain. So what there is there is an environment and there's an exchange of energy, matter, and information with the anatomical system. Now there are sensory organs like the eye, the ear, the nose, and this gains information about the environment. Now this can relate with the cognitive system. So like the central nervous system, the brain, the brain is, and the controlling factors are not just limited to the physical brain. It can extend out into the body as well, the brain-body interconnection. But basically the cognitive system then controls what is the action that's going to be taken. Is there some motor control, a movement of an arm or a leg, or other kind of action? So this is an example of an extremely sophisticated control system. There's sensing from the environment. A controller, essentially the brain body system, is dictating specific actions. And what's also really interesting about this is also called a second order cybernetic system, where the control system itself can change over time. So it's not like a fixed control system, like the same senses always produces the same outputs. The brain can forget information. It can have memory, short-term, long-term memory. Sometimes memories are put into more of an unconscious memory space. So the brain itself is changing. So the control system is also evolving. So it's possible in control systems for the controller to change over time. And what this allows is for humans to create highly ordered systems and societies and to learn over time that there's not just genetic evolution, but also cognitive changes can occur in one lifetime where humans can learn things and continuously change. So this creates a really rapid ability to learn new ideas and use this knowledge to create highly ordered structures we see in the world. So thanks for tuning in. Today was all about the creation of ordered in systems, which is essential to biology. We looked at, some of the key cycles with the Carnot heat engine. How is it possible to extract work from heat? How can work be used to counter the effects of entropy through endergonic reactions, power order creation processes? Life uses metabolic reactions in highly controlled ways, works to create a cell. These different biological processes balance each other in a homeostasis, and this creates the whole cell. Now, the cell can exist as a multicellular organization. There can also exist ecological patterns that can create swarm intelligence and other behaviors. So thanks for tuning in. Next chapter is going to be all about information. See you next time.